Do it? Okay. What we're going to do is we are going to talk about the Jackson administration, Andrew Jackson office. If you'll remember, in 1824, Andrew Jackson probably felt a little bit like Bernie Sanders did in 2016, that he had been robbed of the chance to be president of the United States. Jackson's going to come back in this next election. There's going to be a number of differences, a number of changes. For example, now in the election of 1828, the selection of electors is going to be tied to the popular vote of the citizens. So each voting district will determine which electors are going to go for which president. Different states will have they will either require by law, require by tradition, or not require that the electors vote for who the people told them to, but each state has its own electoral process. So it's not something that the federal government is legislating. So we're going to talk about Jackson and his presidency, his election, and then we'll, in the second part, we'll look at two separate crises in Andrew Jackson's administration. Okay, popular party, partisan politics in this election, and then the Jackson Democratic agenda. Now, 1828, a change in the political process. As I said, voters now determine the electors, not merely the state legislatures. I guess for those of you who voted in the primaries for Tennessee, when you voted in the primary, not only did you vote for the candidate, but you also, for Tennessee, you voted for the number of electors who are assigned to that, who are established as the electors for that candidate. Like I said, each state has a different process by which they do this. Tennessee, each candidate has a series of electors. If that candidate wins, those electors are the ones who are sent to the convention. Okay. Voter restrictions are going to be eased during this time period. At this point, all but 3 states have what's referred to as universal white male suffrage. Now, the biggest problem is that's not universal. Universal white male suffrage. That means all free white men, right, are allowed to vote, right? So what does that do for the women? No voting. What's that do to the slaves? No voting. So the textbooks call it universal white male suffrage, but see, what had happened prior to this, most states, in order for you to be allowed to vote, you had to own enough property, make enough money to have to pay taxes, because that's our establishment. This is what requires us to have representative government, is you have no taxation without representation. And so most of the states believe that if you don't have something invested in the state, in the country, you don't have the right to vote. This is going to start to change again to a universal suffrage model as we move forward from here. Okay? In 1828, because of these changes, that it's no longer the state legislatures who are appointing these electors, it's the people, a new campaigning style is going to emerge from this period. Now, neither Andrew Jackson nor John Quincy Adams participates in this sort of grandstanding kind of campaign opportunity, but their supporters do, especially like Henry Clay. Henry Clay, big supporter of Adams and a political enemy of Andrew Jackson. They're going to refer to these guys as gastronomic Ciceros and barbecue orators, because they'll come into a town campaigning for their candidate, and they'll bring the big bandwagon. You've heard the expression, get on the bandwagon. Well, it's because they had a wagon, and the band was on the wagon, and all the signs for that candidate. They would roll into town, and they would start giving speeches and everything. And in the midst of the speeches, somebody would start barbecuing a pig or a half a cow, and they would have a massive pig roaster, massive barbecue. And then they would give their political speeches. It was an attempt to create popular favor for one candidate over another. One candidate over another. Jackson is the first candidate in our political system to use his nickname in his campaign. He had garnered the nickname Old Hickory because he was tough as an old hickory tree. And so all of this kind of popular campaigning is going to become the rule of the day. Okay? Partisan newspapers are going to pop up all over the country because the press is instrumental in influencing popular opinion. Influencing popular opinion. 1828, the parties officially still reject party names. They call themselves the Jackson Party or the Adams Party. They still call themselves that, but by 1832, official names for these two political ideologies are going to rise to the top. Okay, Clay will be the leader of what are called the National Republicans. The National Republicans. And Jackson will be the leader of the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans. The National Republicans are sort of the remnant of what was the old Federalist Party, this notion of a strong centralized government. Okay? And that fits well with Henry Clay's ideology of the American system. Eventually, these two Republican parties will have their names shortened. In 34, the National Republicans will be known as the Whig Party, and the Democratic Party will be Jackson's. The Democrat Party of Jackson is the Democrat Party we have today. It is the national party from this time. The Whig Party, you can make a very strong case, is the Whig Party was created almost, I don't want to say exclusively, but for the most part, as an anti-Jackson party. Many people who did not support a strong, powerful, centralizing government joined the Whig Party anyway because they opposed Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is the kind of politician who, well, there's no middle of the road. You either really, really like him or you really, really don't like him. There's nobody who says, I could take him or leave him. Kind of like the political circumstances today. So what happens? Well, these two guys start blasting each other from their campaigns. I remember I showed you the video of earlier talk. These guys are really bad with each other. Newspapers start printing these partisan stories against each other. Party politics used to solidify support. Popular campaigning style of speeches and barbecues and things like that. Jackson attempts to display Adams as an aristocrat who's out of touch with the common man. Adams tries to display Jackson as the bastard son of a prostitute. And you know, it wouldn't be so bad if it weren't true. But Andrew Jackson, he turns it around. Andrew Jackson says, that's right, I come from humble beginnings. I didn't have everything handed to me. I had to work, but that's the kind of country I live in. Look at me now. Look at me now. So Jackson was able to turn that kind of negative press around to wind up being in his favor, because he appealed to the common man. And since it was the voters who were now selecting the electors for the Electoral College, it was important. Now, just before the election, one of these newspaper reporters, a Whig newspaper, attacks his relationship with his wife, Rachel. Now, backtrack all the way to early Tennessee history. When Andrew Jackson comes from North Carolina to a place called Nashboro, which later becomes Nashville, he stays at a boarding house. The boarding house is owned by the Donaldsons. The Donaldsons' daughter, Rachel, lives there with them at the boarding house. Now, Rachel had been married before. Rachel had been married to one of the early settlers, one of the early explorers. He was a guy sort of like Daniel Boone, exploring the back countries and things like that. And so Rachel marries this guy. Well, once things start getting settled in Nashboro, he wants to go out towards Memphis and beyond across the Mississippi River. He wants to continue exploring. He's got the what people call the wanderlust. Rachel doesn't want to go. Rachel's parents don't want her to go. And so he is going to give her a divorce, right? Basically, he is going to claim to be abandoning her, and he's taking off so he can start exploring the western frontiers. And so Rachel gets her divorce. Shortly after that, Andrew Jackson comes to town, hangs up his shingle as a lawyer, and Jackson and Rachel will eventually marry. Okay? So, during this election, this ex-husband comes back, and he's in Nashville, and the reporters say, "Hey, weren't you married to Rachel Jackson?" And he says, "Ha ha, she was Rachel Donaldson when I knew her, blah blah blah." And he's not trying to stir up trouble. He says, "But however, I got the wanderlust, and so we had a divorce." And they're like, "Oh, so you got divorced?" He said, "Yep, got the papers right here." And he pulled out his little oilskin pouch, and he pulled out the divorce papers. And the newspaper reporter looks at it and says, "You didn't take this to the courthouse?" What's that mean?
Still married.
They're still married. They're still married. So the guy, the next day, the newspaper reporter publishes in the paper, "How can we vote? How can we elect a president who would be married to a base bigamist?" And he accused Rachel of being a bigamist. Now, here's the problem for this newspaper reporter. He could have said anything about Andrew Jackson he wanted to. Andrew Jackson, he wouldn't have liked it, but you know what? That's how you do business. When he attacked Rachel and her character and her honor, Jackson challenges him to a duel. Jackson challenges him to a duel. Okay? Let's see if I've got this. Nope, not yet. Okay, so here's what happens. Dueling is illegal. Nashville is up close to the northern border of Tennessee. Dueling's illegal in Tennessee. So Jackson takes this guy across the border into Kentucky. Does anybody remember whose state Kentucky is? Say Henry Clay.
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay, that's correct. Henry Clay. And what's Henry Clay's relationship with Andrew Jackson?
Doesn't like him.
Not very good. He doesn't like him at all. So Jackson goes. Now Jackson is a skinny guy. But his second is a fella who looks more like me, an individual of prestigious girth. So Jackson has this guy trade coats with him. So Jackson puts on this great big coat, and he sort of swims in it. And so him and this other guy stand there, and they mark off their paces, and they both turn around, and this guy shoots first, and the bullet comes, and it hits Jackson in the side, right, and lodges in under one of his ribs. Okay? It didn't hit any organs, but it lodges under one of his ribs, and then Jackson pulls his pistol down and just blows this guy away and kills him. Henry Clay is screaming bloody murder. You know, how can we elect a person who murders this man because of what he wrote in the news? Blah, blah, blah. Was it murder?
Yeah.
It was a duel. And it was in Kentucky where dueling was legal. In Tennessee, it would have been murder. And that's basically sort of the way Jackson punches Clay in the eye. He says, "Oh, if it was Tennessee, it would have been murder. But since it was the backward state of Kentucky, which still allows dueling, well, Jackson kills this guy, and he goes on to the election. What happens in the election? Andrew Jackson cakewalks with it. 178 electoral votes to 83. So Jackson becomes president without any problem whatsoever. if you'll notice, there's only 2 people running now, because also people are running with running mates. The person who's going to be vice president is running with the person who's the president. So now there's no longer 4. So this electoral process has been altered. So now the Electoral College is selecting the individual that they want to be president. But you can see the South and the West strongly support Andrew Jackson. Now, the next year after the election, Rachel dies. His wife dies. And he really, regardless of what else we think about Andrew Jackson loved his wife. He mourns for Rachel. The whole rest of his administration, he mourns for Rachel because she was everything for him. And he's also still got the bullet in his side. They didn't remove it. It was lodged in there, but he's taking medicine for it. He's given himself a little bit of mercury every day, right? Quicksilver, so that little bit of mercury will protect him from the lead poisoning. So technically, he's poisoning himself by taking this mercury every day as a cure-all for having this bullet. He's still extremely, extremely popular. He's thought of the president of the common man. Very, very popular inauguration speech. It only lasts 10 minutes. And then after the speech, he opens the White House lawn for a big kegger. They have kegs of beer and pigs being roasted, and it's just a massive, almost like a block party going on in the White House. Some textbooks have excerpts from the I guess it's from the Washington Star and the Washington Post, from the newspapers, the society columns of the day, where they're bemoaning the invasion of the hillbillies into the White House. Martha Washington's good china's being chipped and cracked. People are picking stuff up, putting it in their pockets, carrying away souvenirs. So the highfalutin, the fancy folk of D.C., they weren't really ready for this kind of down home sort of person. But that was his presidency also. It wasn't just a facade. If you wanted to see the president, you walked up to the White House, knocked on the door, and said, "I'd like to see the president. Do you have an appointment? No? Then you'll have to wait in the library until he's free." And they would bring you into the library, and you'd sit down, and he would come in sometimes wearing his robe and slippers. But he would come to see what you wanted, because after all, he's the servant. He's the civil servant. So even uninvited visitors would be welcome in his administration. His cabinet appointments are also going to change. He does select individuals he believes are going to be very partisan, very supportive of him. However, at some point, these cabinet appointees aren't doing what he wants them to do. He's got a very established agenda for what he wants to take place in the country. As a matter of fact, his most loyal supporter, the one who's going to stick closest to him, is Martin Van Buren, his Secretary of State. Martin Van Buren is a politician from New York. Now he completely attaches himself to Jackson, and even helps to keep some of the bad press away from him. He's got this agenda. Okay, what's going to happen with his cabinet appointments? I'll mention this real quick. He won't fire these guys. Okay, he won't fire these guys. What he's going to do is he's just going to stop meeting with them. He's going to stop having them advise him. And instead, late at night in the kitchen of the White House, he is going to meet with a bunch of his old drinking buddies. His drinking buddies, and they'll play cards, and they'll eat sandwiches, and they'll drink whiskey, and they'll discuss political ideas in the kitchen of the White House. And then in the morning, when his official cabinet meets, he comes in, he says, this month, you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do this. If you have a problem with that, you can always bring me your resignation and place it on my desk. But this is what you're going to do, right? The press will finally get wind of this sort of double arrangement, and they'll start making reference to Andrew Jackson's kitchen cabinet. That's the real advisors, the real cabinet of the White House is meets in the kitchen of the White House. Now, Jefferson, he is Jeffersonian as far as believing the ideas of limited government. He believes that government intervention in the economy would hurt the common man, hence his reasons for being opposed to the American system of Henry Clay. He thinks federal support of these transportation ideas, which eventually will be railroads, but now are canals and roads and bridges, does nothing more than grants monopolies and enormous paydays and charters to wealthy investors, people who don't need. They should be able to pay for these things on their own. He does support what's called the rapid settlement of the interior lands, which the interior lands is the territories that have yet to be settled. And so Indian policy is going to be a big, high priority for him. Jackson is going to push his Indian policy agenda. He will use the veto power 12 times in his presidency. 12 times. All the other presidents put together only use the veto power 9 times. Jackson has an agenda. And if the Congress won't go along with his agenda, he will just continue to veto their bills until they go along with his agenda. Jackson knows what Jackson wants to do. And he's going to push this agenda upon them. Okay? Even in 1830, for example, he vetoes a highway bill, a bill that's supposed to provide federal funding to create a highway between Kentucky and Tennessee that goes, I think it went through the Bull's Gap. Jackson liked the bill. He thought it was going to be beneficial for that whole region of the country, until he found out that Henry Clay was the author of the bill. And even though he liked the bill, he hates Henry Clay. And so anything Henry Clay had authored is vetoed. And so Jackson and Henry Clay will not stand together. Matter of fact, at this point, Jackson and Clay can't be in the same room with each other, because they will, the sword canes will come out. So that's all for this introduction to Jackson. And so we're going to, in the next video, we're going to talk about the 2 primary crises of Jackson's administration, and then we'll move on to talk about the railroads and the organization towards abolition of